Thank you for being here. I debated whether to give this talk at all, because what I'm about to share with you will make some people very angry. Not because it's pessimistic, but because it's mechanical. And mechanical truths don't care about your feelings. You know, I've spent more than 50 years watching markets rise and fall. I've seen fortunes built overnight and lost just as quickly. And every time people say the same thing. They say this time is different. But I'll tell you something I've learned through painful experience. It's never different. Human nature hasn't changed. The mechanics haven't changed. Only the dates change. Right now, millions of Americans are celebrating. You've heard about the one big, beautiful bill. You've seen your tax refund projections. You're told you'll save $3,750 this year. And you think, finally, I'm getting ahead. Finally, the system is working for me. But I operate on principles, and the principles tell me you're not getting richer. You're being given paper while they quietly take the purchasing power. This is what I call the money illusion. It's when you confuse the number on your paycheck with actual wealth. And it's the oldest trick in the book because it's worked for 5,000 years. Let me explain what I mean. I see the economy as a machine, a simple machine made of transactions. One person's spending is another person's income. When credit expands, spending rises. When credit contracts, spending falls. Simple parts, complex results. That's the economic machine. But right now, the machine is jamming. We've crossed a threshold this month that changes everything. And almost nobody is talking about it. This week, the U.S. national debt officially crossed $38.5 trillion. Let me say that again because the number is so large it almost loses meaning. $38.5 trillion. That's 38,000 billion. That's more than the combined GDP of China, Japan, and Germany. And here's the part that should terrify you. Interest payments alone now exceed $1 trillion per year. More than we spend on defense. More than Medicare. More than anything except Social Security. We're paying more than $11 billion per week just in interest, not paying down the debt, just servicing it. Former Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, who ran both the Treasury and the Federal Reserve, just warned that we're approaching something called fiscal dominance. That's economists speak for the moment when the government's debt becomes so large that the Federal Reserve can no longer fight inflation without bankrupting the Treasury. When Paul Volcker raised rates in 1980 to crush inflation, debt was 25% of GDP. He had room to maneuver. Today, it's 120% of GDP. The math doesn't work anymore. Now, I'm going to explain exactly why this matters for your family and what you can do about it. But before I do, you need to understand something most people never learn. There are 2 debt cycles, not one, and we're at the end of the long one. I'll show you the template in a few moments. But first, let me tell you about a mistake I made in 1982 that nearly destroyed me, and how it taught me everything I know about what's coming next. In 1982, I was so confident in my analysis that I went on national television and predicted a depression. I was absolutely certain. I had charts, I had data, I had logic, and I was publicly, catastrophically wrong. The market went the opposite direction. I had to let everyone at my company go. I had to borrow $4,000 from my father just to pay my family's bills. I was 33 years old and I had lost everything. That failure taught me the most important lesson of my career. It taught me that I could be wrong. And if I could be wrong about something I was so certain about, then I needed a process that would work even when my opinions failed me. So I studied history, not just the last 10 years, not just the last 50 years, but the last 500 years of economic cycles. I studied the rise and fall of empires. I studied every major debt crisis I could find, and I discovered something remarkable. While events change, the patterns don't. Because human nature doesn't change. Greed and fear operate the same way they did in ancient Rome. The mechanics of debt work the same way they did in the Dutch Empire. The psychology of bubbles is identical whether you're looking at tulips in 1637 or AI stocks in 2025. Let me explain the template I discovered, because once you see it, you'll never look at the economy the same way again. There are two types of debt cycles, the short one and the long one. The short-term debt cycle lasts about 5 to 8 years. It's what most people think of as the business cycle. The economy expands, credit grows, people borrow and spend, inflation rises, the Federal Reserve raises interest rates to cool things down. A recession hits, then rates fall, recovery begins, and the cycle starts over. We've had 13 of these short-term cycles since World War II. Most people think this is all there is. They think the economy just goes up and down every few years, and if you're patient, everything works out. But underneath these short cycles runs something much larger and much more dangerous. I call it the long-term debt cycle, and it lasts 50 to 75 years. Here's how it works. The long-term cycle begins after a major debt crisis, when leverage is low and people are cautious. Credit is tight. Debt burdens are manageable. The economy is what I call healthy. Then, over decades, credit gradually expands. It becomes easier and easier to borrow. Debt-to-income ratios rise slowly, almost invisibly. Each year, people borrow a little more. Each year, the total debt grows a little larger. And because this happens so gradually, nobody notices. It feels normal. It feels like progress. But eventually, the debt burden becomes so heavy that the short-term cycle stops working. Interest rates are already low, so the Fed can't cut them further. Debt payments consume so much income that people can't borrow more. And that's when you get what I call a deleveraging. A deleveraging is painful. It's the process of bringing debt levels back down to sustainable levels. And there are only 4 ways to do it. First, austerity. You can cut spending and use the savings to pay down debt. But this causes a depression because one person's spending is another person's income. Second, debt defaults. Borrowers can stop paying and creditors take losses. But this destroys wealth and causes bank failures. Third, wealth redistribution. You can take money from the rich and give it to those who owe debts. But this creates political conflict and discourages investment. Fourth, money printing. The central bank can create new money to monetize the debt. But this devalues the currency and creates inflation. Usually, governments choose all 4 badly. They print too much money too fast, or they impose austerity too harshly, or they let too many banks fail at once. And the result is chaos. Now, I want to show you that this isn't theory. This is history. This has happened before, many times, and it follows the same pattern every time. The Dutch Empire in the 1780s. The Dutch guilder was the world's reserve currency. The Dutch East India Company was the most valuable corporation in history. Then, debt from wars overwhelmed the system. They printed money to pay the debts. The guilder collapsed. The British pound took over as the world's reserve currency. The British Empire in the 1940s. The pound was the reserve currency. 2 world wars created impossible debt. Britain borrowed from America to survive. They printed money. The pound collapsed. The dollar took over. Weimar Germany in 1923. This one people remember. The government owed war debts it couldn't pay. They printed money, and the results were catastrophic. A loaf of bread cost 250 marks in January. By November, it cost 200 billion marks. Workers were paid twice a day so they could spend their wages before they became worthless. People burned currency for heat because it was cheaper than firewood. And now look at us. The dollar is the world's reserve currency. We've accumulated more debt than any nation in history. The Federal Reserve spent 4 years printing $5 trillion to prop up the system. The government just passed a bill that adds another $3.4 trillion over the next decade. The mechanics are identical, only the dates change. How do you know when you're in the late stage of the long-term debt cycle? I'll tell you exactly what to look for, because we're seeing all of them now. First, interest payments start crowding out other spending. Check. We now pay more in interest than we spend on national defense. Second, the central bank starts buying government debt because nobody else will buy it at low rates. Check. The Fed's balance sheet went from $900 billion to over $7 trillion. Third, gold starts outperforming stocks and bonds. Check. Gold rose 65% last year. The S&P 500 rose 18%, but measured in gold, it actually fell 28%. Fourth, capital starts flowing out of the country. Check. Non-U.S. stocks outperformed U.S. stocks for the first time in years. Emerging markets beat the S&P 500. Britain's FTSE 100 outperformed our markets. Fifth, the currency starts declining. Check. The dollar fell 10% against a basket of currencies last year. Morgan Stanley called it the worst decline in more than 2 decades. This isn't prediction. This is recognition. I've seen this movie before. I've studied it in dozens of countries across centuries of history. I know how it ends. Now let me show you how this plays out in your actual life in January 2026. The government says you have more money. The working family's tax cut gives the average household $3,750. The standard deduction rose to $32,200. On paper, you're ahead. But here's what they don't tell you. Medicare Part B premiums just jumped nearly 10% to $202.90 per month. That's $2,435 per year for seniors. If you're on Medicare, almost 2/3 of your tax cut just disappeared. Private insurance premiums are rising at the fastest rate in 15 years. The average family health insurance plan now costs over $25,000 annually. Property taxes have doubled in many states over the past decade. If you own a home in Florida, California, Texas, or New Jersey, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Auto insurance is up 50% since 2021. Car insurance that cost $100 a month now costs $150. Food prices are still 25% higher than they were 4 years ago. Add it up. Your $3,750 tax cut is being eaten, often more than eaten, by cost increases they didn't bother to mention. You're running faster just to stay in the same place. That's not getting ahead. That's treading water while the current gets stronger. But it's worse than that, because we haven't even talked about purchasing power. Here's the mechanical truth most people miss. The government doesn't have money to give you. It's $38.5 trillion in debt. So where does your tax cut come from? It comes from borrowing. And when you borrow at this scale, you have to pay interest. And when you can't pay the interest, you print money. And when you print money, the currency loses value. That's why gold, which produces nothing, which pays no dividends, which just sits there, outperformed the S&P 500 by 47 percentage points last year. Not because gold became more valuable, because the dollar became less valuable. Let me put this in terms that really matter. If you earned 18% on your S&P 500 stocks last year, congratulations. But if the dollar fell 10% against other currencies, your real return in global terms was closer to 8%. And if inflation was 4%, your actual purchasing power gain was about 4%. Now compare that to gold, up 65% in dollar terms. After adjusting for the dollar decline and inflation, gold holders gained over 50% in real purchasing power. But here's what really matters. Because measured in gold, the oldest money in the world, the S&P 500 actually lost 28% of its value last year. Your stocks went up in dollar terms, but in terms of real money, you got poorer. This is the paradigm shift I've been warning about. We're moving from a world where you get rich by holding dollars and buying US assets to a world where you get poor by doing the same thing. The rules are changing, and most people don't even know it's happening. Let me paint you a picture of what this looks like in real life. Imagine you're 62 years old. You've worked your whole life. You've done everything right. You've saved $500,000 in your 401k. You own your home outright. You have no debt. You think you're set. But your property taxes have gone from $4,000 to $8,000 a year. Your homeowner's insurance is up $3,000. Your Medicare premium just jumped $250 a year. Your grocery bill is up $400 a month. Your cost of living went up more than $10,000 last year. But your Social Security cost of living adjustment was only $2,400. You're losing $7,600 a year in real terms. And you haven't made a single bad decision. You followed the rules. You did what you were supposed to do. But the rules changed. That's not your failure. That's the mechanics of the long-term debt cycle playing out. One person's spending is another person's income, and the government is spending money it doesn't have, which means it has to take it from you through inflation. Now here's the canary in the coal mine. Consumer credit is cracking. Auto loan delinquencies just hit a 15-year high. 3.88% of auto loans are now 30 days or more past due, and the number is climbing. Federal Reserve economists are calling it a warning sign for the broader economy. Credit card delinquencies reached nearly 9% last quarter. That's a rate not seen since the Great Financial Crisis. Americans now owe $1.12 trillion on credit cards alone. And here's what's critical. The people defaulting aren't just young people who made bad decisions. The fastest growing delinquency rates are among people over 60. When seniors start defaulting, it means the system is under real stress. It means retirement income can no longer keep up with the cost of living. And when that happens, the next logical step is asset liquidation. Selling homes, selling stocks, selling whatever they can just to stay afloat. That's not a prediction, that's arithmetic. And the arithmetic is getting worse every month. Now, I need to explain the trap the Federal Reserve is in, because understanding this is the key to everything that follows. The Fed has two official jobs: control inflation and support employment. But there's a third job nobody talks about publicly. Don't bankrupt the Treasury. Here's the problem. If the Fed raises rates to fight inflation, interest payments on the debt explode. At current debt levels, every 1% increase in rates adds roughly $300 billion to annual interest costs. The government is already paying over $1 trillion in interest. Another rate hike could add hundreds of billions more. But if the Fed cuts rates to ease the debt burden, inflation stays elevated, the dollar falls further, and your purchasing power erodes. Either way, you lose. This is what economists call fiscal dominance. It's when debt becomes so large that the central bank is no longer free to fight inflation. Instead, it becomes what Janet Yellen just called the fiscal authority's financing arm. She should know. She ran both institutions. She was chair of the Federal Reserve, and she was Secretary of the Treasury. And she's now warning that the preconditions for fiscal dominance are clearly strengthening. Her exact words. And now there's a new variable: political pressure on the Fed. President Trump has publicly demanded that the Federal Reserve lower interest rates, explicitly to reduce the government's debt servicing costs. He's tried to remove Fed governors who disagreed with him. The Supreme Court is currently deciding whether he has that power. Fed Chair Jerome Powell's term ends in May of this year. 2 additional Fed governor seats are coming open. By the end of 2026, the administration will have named at least 3 of the 7 governors. Former Cleveland Fed President Loretta Mester said recently that the scariest component of the current situation is that the administration may not understand the implications of what they're doing. Previous governments knew they were on a precipice, she said, even if they didn't act responsibly. This government may not realize the implications. If the Fed loses its independence, if it becomes a tool of political expediency, then we enter a phase I've studied in dozens of countries. It never ends well. Turkey tried it. President Erdogan pressured the central bank to keep rates low. Inflation hit 85%. Argentina tried it. They've had multiple currency collapses, multiple periods of hyperinflation. The peso is essentially worthless compared to what it was 20 years ago. Weimar Germany tried it. We know how that ended. Now let me tell you about the specific trigger that worries me most. For the past 2 years, the U.S. stock market has been held up by one thing: the AI boom. 7 companies, the so-called Magnificent Seven, drove most of the gains. Their earnings grew 22%, while the other 493 S&P companies grew only 9%. I've said publicly that the AI boom is now in the early stages of a bubble. I'll be releasing my bubble indicator report soon, but the signs are clear. Stretched valuations, consensus optimism, everyone on the same side of the trade. The Federal Reserve's new chair and the committee appear biased to push nominal and real interest rates down, which would be supportive to prices and inflate bubbles. That's how bubbles form. Easy money chases the popular trade until valuations lose all connection to reality. When everyone agrees, there's no one left to buy. And when there's no one left to buy, prices reverse. I've seen it happen dozens of times in my career. The mechanics are always the same. And here's where it gets personal. This year, new super catch-up contribution limits took effect. If you're between 60 and 63 years old, you can now put an extra $11,250 into your 401k, on top of the regular limits. The government is telling you, put more money in the market, you'll get a tax break. But ask yourself, why? Because they need your liquidity. They need you to buy stocks so the market stays up. They need the wealth effect to keep people spending. They need you to be the exit liquidity for institutions that are quietly diversifying. I'm not telling you to avoid 401ks entirely, but I am telling you to understand what you're buying and why. Because if you dump your extra cash into an overpriced market just to get a tax break, and the bubble deflates, you will be left holding the bag. It happened in 2000 with tech stocks. The Nasdaq fell nearly 80%. People who bought at the top waited 15 years just to break even. It happened in 2008 with housing. People who thought their home equity made them rich suddenly owed more than their homes were worth. The mechanics are the same, only the asset changes. So when does this come to a head? I can't give you a date. Anyone who tells you exactly when a bubble will pop is selling you something. But I can tell you the conditions are in place. Debt to GDP at 120% and rising. Interest payments exceeding $1 trillion. A central bank caught between inflation and insolvency. Political pressure on Fed independence. A market priced for perfection. Consumers already cracking under the weight of higher prices. The government's funding expires January 30th. Social Security's trust fund is projected to run dry in 2032, just 6 years from now, within this administration's planning horizon. The AI bubble could pop on any earnings miss. One disappointing quarter from Nvidia or Microsoft, one sign that AI spending isn't generating returns, and the whole edifice could crack. When one domino falls, the rest follow. And the first domino could fall any month now. The question isn't if, it's when and how fast. Now, I don't want to leave you in despair, because there is a way through this, both for you personally and potentially for the country. I call it a beautiful deleveraging. It's when policymakers balance four levers carefully. Some austerity, some debt restructuring, some wealth redistribution, some money printing. When done right, debts decline relative to income, growth stays positive, and inflation remains manageable. The United States achieved something close to this after World War II. Debt to GDP was even higher then, around 120%. But we grew our way out through productivity gains and moderate inflation over decades. But a beautiful deleveraging requires discipline, balance, and honesty. And right now, I see none of those things in Washington. Neither party is willing to cut spending or raise taxes meaningfully. Nobody is willing to tell the truth about what's coming. So you have to be your own central bank. You have to manage your own balance sheet. You have to prepare for what's coming, even if the government won't. Here's what I'm doing, and what I believe the principles suggest for you. Step 1. Don't spend the tax cut. That extra $3,750 isn't for spending. It's not even for investing in the traditional sense. It's for hedging. Keep it liquid. Keep it accessible. Don't lock it into assets you can't reach. When a deleveraging hits, liquidity is everything. The people who survive are the ones who have cash when everyone else needs it. The people who thrive are the ones who can buy assets at the bottom when everyone else is forced to sell. I had billions in cash in 2008 when the panic hit. That's how I was able to buy great companies at fire sale prices. I didn't predict the crash perfectly, but I was ready for it. You can apply the same principle on a smaller scale. You don't need billions. You just need enough liquidity to survive 12 months without selling your core assets. That's your cushion. That's your insurance. Step 2. Reject the super catch-up trap. I'm not saying don't save for retirement. I'm saying don't pile more money into 401ks that are heavy in U.S. stocks and bonds at the top of a bubble. If you do contribute, diversify internationally. Own assets that aren't tied to the U.S. debt problem. Look at international stocks, which outperformed last year. Look at emerging markets, which had a banner year. Look at assets denominated in currencies other than the dollar. The goal is not to bet against America. The goal is to not have all your eggs in one basket when that basket is on fire. Step 3. Own what the printing press can't dilute. Gold isn't perfect. It doesn't pay dividends. It doesn't compound. It just sits there. But it's real money, money that governments can't print. Gold rose 65% last year for a reason. Central banks around the world are buying it because they know what's coming. China has been the largest buyer for several years. India is reducing its treasury holdings while increasing gold reserves. Even European central banks are adding to their positions. When the people who run monetary systems are buying gold, that tells you something about what they expect to happen to paper money. I'm not saying put everything in gold, but having 10 to 15% of your portfolio in assets that can't be printed makes sense when governments are printing trillions. Step 4. Diversify globally. Non-US stocks outperformed last year. Emerging markets had their best year in a long time. Britain's FTSE 100 beat the S&P 500. European and Chinese markets outperformed. This isn't temporary. This is capital recognizing that the US is no longer the only game in town. When you measure returns in gold rather than dollars, international assets look even better. The dollar's dominance isn't ending tomorrow, but it is diminishing, and portfolios that are 100% US focused are taking on more risk than most people realize. Step 5. Hold liquidity. Cash is trash when currencies are stable and inflation is low. But cash is king when everything else is falling. Have at least 6 months of expenses in accessible savings. Not because you're scared, because you're prepared. When the deleveraging comes, the people with liquidity will have options. The people without it will be forced to sell at the worst possible time. I've spent my career looking for what I call the holy grail of investing. It's not finding the best asset. It's finding 15 to 20 uncorrelated return streams that balance each other. When you do that, you can reduce your risk by 80% without reducing your expected return. That's the mathematics of diversification. That's how you build a portfolio that can weather any storm. The worst thing you can do right now is have all your eggs in one basket, especially if that basket is denominated in dollars, invested in U.S. assets, and dependent on the government's ability to manage its debt responsibly. Spread out, stay liquid, own real things. Let me close with a principle that has guided me through every crisis in my 50-year career. Pain plus reflection equals progress. What's coming will be painful for many people. But pain is not the enemy. Pain is information. It tells you what's not working. And if you reflect on it honestly, it becomes the seed of growth. The crash isn't an event. It's a process. And that process accelerated this month, January 2026, when we crossed the red line of $38.5 trillion in debt. Evolution is the single greatest force in the universe. It works through cycles of challenge and adaptation. The organisms that survive aren't the strongest or the smartest. They're the ones that adapt. Adapt now. Don't wait for the headlines. Don't wait for permission. The mechanics are clear. And remember what I always say. It's not about what you make in the good times. It's about what you keep in the bad times. Now, before I close, I want to address something I hear constantly. People say, "Ray, you've been warning about debt for years. Why should I believe it matters now?" Here's my answer. I'm not predicting a crash tomorrow. I'm describing mechanics that are already in motion. The debt crossed 38 trillion. The interest payments crossed 1 trillion. The Fed is politically compromised. Consumer credit is cracking. Gold is outperforming everything. These aren't predictions. These are observations. The question isn't whether the mechanics will play out. The question is how fast and how painful. Throughout my career, I've learned that the biggest mistakes come from not being prepared for things that have happened before, but not in your lifetime. That's why I study history so obsessively. That's why I look at patterns across centuries instead of years. The long-term debt cycle I've described happens roughly once every 50 to 75 years. The last one in America ended after World War II. Before that, the 1830s. Before that, the Revolutionary period. Most people alive today have never experienced what happens when a long-term debt cycle ends. That's why they don't see it coming. That's why they keep saying, this time is different. But I've studied what happened in those previous cycles. I've studied what happened in other countries when their cycles ended. And I can tell you with certainty, the mechanics don't change. Only the circumstances do. So what should you do with this information? First, don't panic. Panic is the enemy of good decision-making. The deleveraging process takes years, not days. You have time to prepare if you start now. Second, diversify. Really diversify. Not just across stocks, but across asset classes, across currencies, across geographies. The goal is to have no single point of failure. Third, stay informed. Watch the signals I mentioned. Interest rate moves, gold prices, dollar strength, consumer delinquencies. These are the early warning signs. Fourth, be patient. The people who come out ahead in deleveragings are the ones who maintain their composure while everyone else panics. They're the ones who have liquidity when others need to sell. They're the ones who can wait for the bottom. I've been through multiple crises in my career. 1971, when Nixon closed the gold window. 1982, when I nearly lost everything. 1987's Black Monday crash. The Asian financial crisis. The dot-com bust. 2008's global financial crisis. Every time, the people who survived and thrived were the ones who understood the mechanics and stayed calm. I want to hear from you. Comment below and tell me, what's your biggest financial concern right now? Have you seen the effects of this squeeze in your own life? Share your story because we need to see the pattern together. And if you found this helpful, share it with someone you care about, especially anyone over 60. The more people understand what's coming, the fewer will fall victim to it. Thank you.